Noble Truths, Dependent Origination, other topics. But chapter 11, we have analysis of the path factors. Then we have first the analysis according to the suttas. So what is the Noble Eightfold Path? Right view to right concentration. Then what is right view? Knowledge of suffering, knowledge of the cause of suffering, knowledge of the cessation of suffering, knowledge of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. This is called right view. So this is in conformity with the many other suttas that we're familiar with. Then comes the analysis according to the Abhidhamma method. Okay, the Eightfold Path is right view, right thought, right speech, right action, to right concentration. What is the Eightfold Path? Okay, first factor we have is right view. Then what is right view? That which is wisdom, understanding, knowledge, the faculty of wisdom, the power of wisdom, the investigation of states enlightenment factor, the absence of dullness, the investigation of truth. Right view is a constituent of the path. This is called right view. And so you could see the analysis according to the Abhidhamma is almost exactly the same as the explanation of this right view, this world-transcending right view of the Discourse on the Great 40. And so it's an interesting question. There's two possibilities. One possibility is that the Discourse on the Great 40 represents a stage where the Abhidhamma method of explanation is starting to emerge, but it's not yet been compiled into a formal system yet. And so these are sort of, we call these traces of Abhidhamma method starting to emerge within the suttas. Maybe within the early Sangha there were discussions taking place, and some of the teachers would start developing this more analytical method of explanation. And then some of those explanations then found their way into the Sutta Pitaka. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that the Abhidhamma already had emerged, at least in the elementary stage. And now, as the monks were looking back at the older suttas, they thought that maybe some of these definitions in the suttas are not precise enough. And so what they decided to do is to take material from the Abhidhamma and put it into the suttas in order to give a more precise definition and distinction of the nature of some of these concepts introduced in the suttas. Yeah, this I have no way to decide between them. I think Venerable Analayo tends to the view that the Abhidhamma type ideas were starting to emerge, and in this way they found their way into the suttas. But I'm not so sure that there's evidence for that view as against the view that the Abhidhamma had already reached some degree of systematization, and then Abhidhammic ideas were incorporated back into the suttas. I know this gets a bit technical and scholarly, but I think to understand what's going on in a sutta like this, one has to bring in that information. If anybody has any questions, then please feel, yeah, Rob. But please take the microphone.
Thank you. Bhante, I have two questions. One is with reference to Tilakkana, Anicca, Dukkha, Anattma,
Yeah.
which from my layman's understanding, it's very fundamental. it's a fundamental, what you call, right view. To be
topic
part
or theme,
one of the important right. But that's not mentioned in this in that form.
That's interesting.
I noticed that. The second question is...
Wait, let's take one at a time.
Oh, okay.
Of course, otherwise I'll forget the first. But if you ask an interesting second question, I might forget the first one. Yeah, that's an interesting and important point because, well, the commentaries distinguish at least four aspects of right view. Okay, one is called the right view of karmic causation. That's like the right view that's given here, that there's merit in giving, making offerings, looking after mother and father. The second is called the right view of insight, and that would be the right view into impermanence, suffering, non-self. Then the third is the right view of the path. That's the world-transcending right view in this momentary path consciousness. The fourth is the right view that's present in the fruition. There's a fifth right view, but I don't remember what it is. Okay, so it's interesting that that kind of right view is not mentioned here, but I would say that that right view, technically it would belong to the preliminary, preparatory path, but it's a higher type of right view than the right view of karma and its fruit.
The second question is, Bhante, with all due respect to the Mahayana tradition, which I have no problem, to me all came from the Buddha. Buddhism, I understand, went to China through Bodhidharma, but Reverend Bodhi.
Oh, no, that's not the case. Bodhidharma was the one who transmitted what came to be called Zen or Chan Buddhism to China. But go on, continue.
So, I believe it went in a little later into China. I'm not saying that it didn't come from, it would have come from the same route. But it went to China later, and from there they say went to Japan and Korea. So, how the writing in the Theravada tradition is supposed to have come also directly from the time of Emperor Asoka or before, from the Buddha to Asoka and to all over the world. So how you can say that the Chinese version is older than the Theravada?
Okay. This is important.
To me it's a little confusing.
This is important and interesting point, because one thinks that the Buddhism that's been practiced in China, it's predominantly Mahayana Buddhism. So then one might think, okay, the versions of the Agamas are Mahayana Buddhist texts. That's not the case, but they were actually, classically they say, or traditionally, 18 schools of early Buddhism in India by the 2nd century after the Buddha. Maybe the 18 didn't all have their own separate collections, but there were at least about 5 different major schools which had their own collections of the Nikayas, also called the Agamas. So basically it's the same collection of texts. They're not Mahayana schools. They are text schools that fall within, sometimes I don't like to use the word Hinayana, which has a derogatory sense, but they fall under the scope, we'll call it, of early Buddhism. And so, we shouldn't think that the Theravada has preserved the only exact, exclusive, faithful collection of texts, and the other schools got the texts, jumbled up and distorted. But each school was preserving the original corpus of texts, and sometimes, because of the faults of the reciters, sometimes I think decisions were made collectively in groups of monks to add material, to rearrange material. So these are coming from early collections. It's just that there are different lines of transmission of the same, what was originally the same collection of texts. Of course, they were written in China later than the Pali scriptures were written in Sri Lanka, but the texts that were translated into Chinese and then written in Chinese would have come from the Majjhima Agama is traced, I believe, to the Sarvastivada school, which was a school that flourished in northwest India. around the area of Kashmir. Then there's another school, which is called the Mula Savastivada, which flourished someplace in central India. Its text went to Tibet, and also to China. And now interestingly, there's a version of the sutta which came translated into Chinese, but it came into the Chinese version of the Sutta Nikaya, and it makes similar distinction that the Pali version does between the mundane and world transcending aspect of the path factors. Let me see if I could find that. Yeah, okay, Venerable Analayo says, if I could read what he says, notably, if that's Venerable Analayo, tell him I have something to tell him. Okay, he says, notably, the Theravada tradition is not alone in making a distinction between mundane and supramundane path factors in its collection of suttas. A somewhat similar exposition can be found twice in the Samyukta Agama, that's the counterpart of the Samyutta Nikaya, a collection probably belonging to the Mula Savastivada tradition. Then he translates this sutta, which is called the Discourse on Right and Wrong. Okay, so the Buddha calls the attention of the monks, and then he says, what is right view? Right view is of two types. There is right view that is mundane with influxes, that's with the asavas, with grasping, I think that's upadhi, that turns towards rebirth in a good destination. And there is right view that is noble, world transcending, without the asavas, without grasping, that eradicates suffering and turns towards the transcendence of suffering. Then what is the right view that is mundane with the asavas? That is the right view that there is giving, charity, offerings, and so on. And then what is the right view that is noble, world transcending, without influxes? This is when a noble disciple gives attention to dukkha or suffering as suffering, to its origin, to its cessation, and to the path. That is the right view. To the path, the investigation of dharmas, the discrimination, inquiry, realization, wisdom, awakening, and contemplative examination. That is the right view that is noble, world transcending, without the asavas, without grasping. So there we see almost the same kind of distinction made in this text, which has come to China, translated into Chinese, but from a different school than the Chinese Majjhima Agama, but which makes that same distinction as the Pali Sutta does. So it's quite a jumble for scholars to sort out. Okay, did somebody else have a question? Hector, okay.
I was just wondering if you could date when the Abhidhamma may have influxed the sutta that we're talking about.
May have influenced it.
Yeah.
Well, I would assume that the Abhidhamma already existed as a separate system and then influenced it later. But I said that there's two possibilities. One is that the Abhidhamma had not yet formed a distinct system, but it was just a particular type of investigation and analysis that was taking place in an early stage in the development of Buddhism after the earliest period. And so my understanding is that what came to be called the Abhidhamma would have developed probably with the Venerable Sariputta and the disciples of Sariputta, continuing over several generations. So I don't know, how much of the systematic Abhidhamma would have been introduced by Sariputta himself, how much by several late generations to follow. But I would guess already by the 1st century after the passing away of the Buddha, already Abhidharmic modes of analysis had already taken shape. This would be even before the schools went their separate way. I would say a basic foundation of Abhidharmic modes of thought had already emerged, because when we compare the two major Abhidharma systems, we could see certain similarities in the older strata of their texts. And then as the texts, when we come to the later texts, we could see the differences start to increase. So perhaps we could say that this version of the sutta, perhaps even by what's held to be the second council, or the third council, second council maybe 100 years, a little more after the passing of the Buddha. Third council, perhaps 150 years. But this is all very speculative.
Thank you.
Bhante, it's a question on right view, the mundane right view.
Yeah.
In the paragraph 7 where they mention about ripening of karma, the effect of karma and so on, doesn't that really relate to rather faith? Because for an ordinary person like us, how can I see that's the right view? Because I haven't seen karma.
Thank you. That's an important point. So the question is whether acceptance of the teachings of karma and its results, that there's fruit or results of good and bad deeds, isn't this a matter of faith rather than direct seeing? And I say that is the case. It's a matter of placing trust in the teachings, the statements of the teachers, just coming down from the lineage of the Buddha. But the Buddha considers this, because he puts it under right view, it's considered an aspect of having right understanding, even though it's not something that we can see directly for ourselves, but it's having, because it forms the foundation for the whole practice of the path, is having the understanding that our actions, our morally significant actions, generate this power or capacity to produce results that correspond to the ethical nature of those actions. So that wholesome actions, virtuous actions produce good or desirable results, and unwholesome actions, bad actions, produce undesirable results. Yeah, I mean, sometimes there are some indications, at least for the reality of rebirth, at least one piece of evidence for this is the case of, this occurs more often in the countries in the East, where there is a belief in rebirth or reincarnation, that there are young children who, almost from the time they're able to form clear sentences, claim that they tell their parents, oh, I have other parents who are living in such and such a village, and there I had maybe one brother and two sisters, and we lived, and they'll describe the house, and then they'll say that I was killed when I stepped out on the road when a bus was rushing by and I was run over, or I fell into a well. And then there were some researchers, especially the late Professor Ian Stevenson, who was at the University of Virginia Medical School, who used to investigate these cases and write them up. And he wouldn't take any cases in which some connection had been made between the family of the child, the present family, and the old family. But where no connection was made, he would do investigations, and often he would find that the old family would say that they would have two daughters and one living son, and they would say that they had a son who got run over by a bus or fell into a well and died. And so there are cases like that. You can find them. Ian Stevenson has published a large number of books. The most popular was called 20 Cases, I think, suggestive of reincarnation. But then he compiled more specialized case studies into larger volumes. Why does it happen to a few?
What happened? Oh, I'm sorry.
What seems to have emerged fairly consistently, or at least predominantly in the cases that were studied by Ian Stevenson, it seems to happen most often when the person in the previous life had died prematurely, either from an illness or an accident. So it seems, this is my conjecture, I think, that the force of the consciousness, because they died as a child or an adolescent, the force of the consciousness was still pretty strong. And so it continues over to the next life. And because the person died by some accident or illness, so the memories of the previous life are still strongly imprinted on the consciousness. But I'd say that for us adults, I have enough trouble remembering where I put my other pair of glasses yesterday. How am I going to remember what I did in my last life? But I think Plato had it right with his myth of the spirits of the dead. They have to drink of the waters of the river of Lethe, that's the river of forgetfulness, before they're able to descend back into the human world and take rebirth. Like if we had all of the memories from a previous life stored up, we'd have to ask Henry to devise a 50 billion gigabytes computer, and we'd spend the first 80 years of our life retyping all of the data that we can remember so that we could have those memories at fingertips from the age of 80 to the year of our death. So in order to be able to function effectively within this world, we have to clear off the slate of memory and start with a blank, a relative blank.
Yeah, actually mentioning Plato is a good segue to my comment, in that I think this is very important, and I could see why the early Sangha started to differentiate between this mundane and super mundane path. The mundane teachings are really shared by other spiritual traditions, not to the exact extent to what the Buddha outlined, but I think there's some shared vocabulary in regards to ethics. etc. But this uniqueness of the Buddha's enlightenment, to really say that it's not all one, you know, that there is this difference, and this is the uniqueness that the Buddha gave to the human family. So I think that that's an important point. Would you have any thoughts on that yourself, Bhante?
I mean, yes, that's definitely the case. And what is called here the right view that's affected by taints, or the mundane right view, this would be not in any way like the unique possession of the Buddha's teaching.
Right.
Like this would have been the shared or the shared or common right understanding amongst many of the spiritual communities of ancient India.
Right.
Like it's considered almost like to be a decent and respectable person, one has to accept this kind of right view. And to hold what is called the wrong view, that there's no results of giving, of making offerings, of good and bad deeds, that would send out tremors in the minds of an Indian of the 5th century, like the designation atheist would in a small town in Iowa or Missouri.
And what I like about the teaching on the mundane right view is that it does give us common ground and vocabulary with speaking with other traditions. But you know, the subtleties, and this is where it's so important, and I've been reflecting on like Sakaya Ditti, for example, that it's a fetter, but it's really, you know, in some ways not a defilement, because the, you know, not having the understanding of Sakaya Ditti doesn't mean that you can't be born in a Brahma world.
Yeah, that is actually the case. That is the case,
And this is where it becomes so subtle, because I think it's hard to really communicate this difference and the uniqueness of the teachings of the Buddha.
But one thing I was intending to add, that even teachings which are considered quite unique to the Buddha, especially the 3 characteristics, well, impermanence and suffering, you could say, are to some extent shared by other spiritual traditions, maybe not as radically and as thoroughly as with the Buddha's teaching, but the teaching of non-self. So taking the 3 characteristics as a group, impermanence, suffering, non-self, those are, you say, as a set, unique to the Buddha's teaching, and yet the contemplation of them or the insight into them is still put into the preliminary preparatory path.
That was so helpful for me, because I really saw that. So that's still a mundane preliminary
we call
path.
it mundane. The word mundane, it doesn't quite have the same connotations as the word mundane does in English, where mundane means something which is just ordinary, everyday, commonplace. But this is mundane used in a rather technical sense, meaning it pertains to the world of the 5 aggregates.
Yes. Actually, you know what just came to mind was in the second foundation of mindfulness with Vedana, how there's that kind of teasing out of worldly sensations or Vedana, and then I believe you translate it as spiritual, which gives an ethical dimension, actually, of the Vedana.
But even in the second foundation of mindfulness and the distinction in the feelings, what's called niramisa, which was translated spiritual, or literally it's non-carnal, is not, it's probably not intended to be the world transcending, but it's just feelings that are free from sensuality, whereas the carnal, or how do we call them? How did I translate it?
Worldly.
Worldly. The worldly feelings are feelings which are bound up with either sensuality or with ordinary mundane concerns, you know, relations with family members, job, wealth, and so on.
Yeah, that's why I was wondering if it could have connected to that preliminary magga, that kind of not truly mundane the way it was described in the beginning, but
yeah, all of those feelings, both the worldly and the spiritual feelings, still would come under the mundane in this sense.
Thank you.
Anybody else have question, comment? We still have about 5 minutes left, and I don't want to go into another path factor. Hector, did you have a simple question? Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just having trouble finding it. Ripening in the acquisitions. I'm not sure that I understand that.
It's a very makeshift rendering. It's very hard to render exactly into English. Okay, what is translated as the acquisitions here is the word upadhi. Upadhi means, the sense is that which is taken up, or that which is used as a basis, or as a foundation. And so the foundation, or the basis, so to speak, are the five aggregates that constitute conditioned existence. The body, feelings, perceptions, the volitional formations, and consciousness. So this type of right view is said to ripen in the acquisitions in the sense that it leads back into the realm of birth and death, back to acquiring a new set of five aggregates. But since it's a right view, it will lead to acquiring the five aggregates or a new existence under fortunate or favorable conditions. And so sometimes, like the state of liberation is called nirupadhi, which means the absence of acquisitions, or freedom from the acquisitions. Yeah, nirodha is sensation, but that's cessation, but that's a different word from nirodha. Yeah. The prefix nir has a negating sense, usually absence of, but nirodha is actually ni plus rodha, not nir plus odha. Okay, so I think then we'll stop for the, okay.
Bhante, again, it's the question on the view. With the view, how can you eliminate those defilements?
With the view, how does one eliminate the defilements?
With the right view, of course.
This is actually a big question, so why don't we save that question for the discussion period, if you'll be coming back?
Yes.
Okay, of course, now we're going to take a break for the lunch. Then we come back here. Let's let you take the lunch a bit leisurely. So we'll come back, we'll meet at 12:30, then we could have a half an hour for discussion. So then you get the first crack at a question when we come back. Okay, so we end with the sharing of the merits I think she handed out the sheets with the verses. So this is to share the merits with the devas, the deities, the bhutas, the fair spirits, the nagas, that's the rain spirits, and other beings, wishing that they rejoice in our merits and that they protect the world, protect the Dharma, protect ourselves and others. Akasata chabumata deva naga medika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga medika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Bhavagopadaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibutim. Okay, we can end with 3 half bows to Buddha. Was this too technical, by the way? This